What up, y'all? I'm Dr. CBS here with my girl, Dr. Layla Brown, and you're tuned into season 2, episode 20 of The Last Dope Intellectual, which is not only our last episode of season 2, but also part 2 of our focus on radical Black women with Dev and Darian of the Groundings podcast.
All right, y'all. So for this week's Shoot the Shit, because it is the last episode of the season, we thought it would be fun to run through some bloopers. And so Two Black has graciously gone back through all of the footage from the season and has pulled some of our silly, funny, stupid moments, and we're just going to watch them and respond. So here we go.
Go. Two Black, come back. How's it going? So are you even paying attention? Were you taking a nap? Huh? Layla had pointed out we need for shooting the shit, we need a title card.
Yeah.
It wasn't?
Mm-mm.
Yeah, there's one.
It is for shooting the shit? Layla.
No, when we first of all, we watched it together when we both said we didn't see one.
What's that?
Don't try. Look at him. He got
it. Like, huh? I thought a broke bitch said something. Hey,
he just went and did that on his own.
I went and did that.
So,
okay. Let me. Oh, hold on. That's off. Okay, so I don't know if that helped or not. Okay. I'm just gonna do the regular outro. I'm not gonna say anything about the special episode, and then we'll figure it out.
You banged on the router or something?
I pissed on it. I'm just kidding. Okay, can you guys hear me? What up, y'all? I'm Dr. CBS here with my girl, Dr. Layla Brown.
You're tuned into season 2, episode 4.
Yeah. Run it back. What up, y'all? I'm Dr. CBS here with my girl, Dr. Layla Brown.
You're tuned into season 2, episode 5 of The Last Dope Intellectual.
Ow.
I do that again, I cleared my throat. Sorry.
Why are you muted, number one?
Also, why is this little ass shit stressful as fuck to me? Okay.
Like, basically, you could just say, okay, for this, we're gonna do this what we on segment a little bit different. I'm gonna talk to the girls, the city girls, about the inside seminar. Oh, we could be the continent girls, the continent girls. Ow.
I'm not saying any of this, but
all right, y'all. So this week's Shoot the Shit is a little bit of everything.
Hold on. Start over. I was like not paying attention. Okay. Yeah. He's a chubby little nerd. I don't like him. He is. If I ever meet him, I'm like, you're a chubby little nerd. Can you turn this video on, Two Black?
Okay, there we go. Hey, how y'all
edit
doing?
that out, Two Black. Okay.
Hey, how y'all doing?
The clip.
Yeah, I remember you
okay. Yeah, you did say that.
You can explain the unique name better than I can. So
let me finish this little body tomorrow.
Yeah.
Fuck you too.
And your mama too.
And your dad.
So I think
was gonna make a joke about having lips, but I won't. Cut this out, Two Black. I was gonna say, just like we have lips, we have our own political orientation. But cut this out, god dang it. Two Black, if this ends up, Layla Brown, and you're tuned into season 2, episode 15 of The Last Dope Intellectual. Boom, one take, ho.
Ready, set, go.
Ow. Okay. All right.
You do this every time. I be trying to collect myself when we start. Okay. I think they're trying to kick him out the library.
Right. Okay.
They haven't bothered me thus far, but yeah. Plus, I got somewhere to be.
I heard you moving your snacks around.
I know. I didn't know if you was packing up your licorice sticks.
You see what I got to deal with, bro? But,
that's what you're gonna do now? You're gonna act like you don't love her?
Don't try to be in solidarity with him against us.
I always act like I don't love y'all. So
just because you
Hater.
flat and ain't got no personality don't mean fucking snacking, okay?
all right, now I'll mute my microphone.
I feel like you should start the segment like that. It's like a fucking bell call.
Hear ye.
A message from Rudolph. Okay, whew, all right.
I'm looking forward to seeing
You reported.
Sharice Burton's Deli.
Yes. Okay.
Hey.
Like she done popped in.
No, hopefully what's his name? Tupac will probably leave this thing because he's a troll. But yes, I can't wait.
I'm not doing the Patreon, so somebody else got to do that.
No, of course. Yeah, Layla's doing it.
Well, damn.
I said that mere minutes ago.
Well, wasn't that lovely too, Black?
Yeah, that was a nice little edit. Y'all got a sneak peek into the struggle bus, the shenanigans that can often take place behind the scenes. Thank you, Too Black, for putting up with the lie. I mean, you had a couple, but we be on that bullshit sometimes. Disproportionately myself, but
I mean, most your shenanigans are mostly snack related, and ours are typically timing. So he's trying to get, and I struggle every fucking week with that damn outro. It's 2 sentences, 3 sentences, I don't know, but it's simple, and that's why it's hard. I can't say anything else about it.
But let me tell you something, at first we were each trying to both do the intro and the outro. That's what we had to switch, because it was like such a lag in between. There was a few of those struggles in there, but
Yeah, I could have just made a video.
If you
on
go
that.
back, yeah, if you go back and watch them, it'll be like, however Sharice ended her first part, and then it'd be like, and that's how I come in every time. It was terrible.
But
Oh man.
it's funny. Some of the Too Like to even put some of the really crazy ones. Again, mostly me acting up, but it's
I know
that was
watch,
hilarious.
Some people watch this with their children, so there was some shit we just couldn't include. But
Facts. But it reminds me of the promo you did for our for our New Year's thing, our end of 2022 countdown. That was my favorite promo, but I feel like that time y'all got a glimpse too into.
I think that was all one episode, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it was all from us recording.
Yeah. I put the bloopers in. Yeah, okay, I remember now. That wasn't supposed to be bloopers. I put those in the promo later.
It was literally the bloopers of us recording the promo.
Right. I just put those in. I thought it made it more interesting. Yeah, I remember that.
And it did. It turned out to be like probably one of the best promos. So yeah.
It's the reason why the show that's essentially 2 hours always requires 3+ hours of recording, because of the shenanigans.
Yeah.
And internet. Shenanigans and internet.
Especially today.
Yes.
Especially today. I mean, I guess I didn't realize I would remember all of that shit that much. Like, most of that I knew where it was, which surprised me. Like, when I was editing it, I guess because I do have to watch the shit multiple times, so it gets stuck in my memory. But that part was weird. Like, I knew where to go, and then there were certain parts I knew I was looking for. Like, even before I got to that episode, like, I knew I was looking for the boom, one take hold. Like, I knew I was looking for that. Because like that was I almost left that in the episode. Like, I remember that. Like, and I just barely took it out. I think I took it out at the very end before I pressed export. So like some shit almost made it anyway. And then I remembered where it was. But it was wild to remember where 20 different episodes and random shit people said. I didn't expect to remember that shit.
You an LDI, or you a fan? You a fan of the show? Period.
I'm also subjective.
I think
of watching it.
It's true. You are subjective.
Live it and relive it.
Yeah.
We've even shifted a little bit, even on how much of that, obviously now we're doing bloopers. We did bloopers. You did bloopers for the promo, but I remember the first time you left one in and we were like, what the fuck was that? And you were like, I like to leave one little thing in here or there. So there was some controversy about that early on in the season too.
Yeah, because on Black Miss, we leave some of that shit in. I mean, I cut out a lot because we be wild too, but like some of that shit, it just helps people because sometimes it should be so damn serious. You just need like something to break the shit up for niggas. Like, like they be like, we talking about genocide or something, and you need to hear somebody stutter or, say some crazy shit. It just helps, with the flow. But yeah, I remember y'all didn't like that, but
we warmed up. But let me just say something for the record. That boom one take home, Layla can attest. That should be exciting. When you just get it in one shot and it's like, bam, wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. It's exciting. So I stand by that. That wasn't even a blooper. That was a real victory for me.
I should have left it in.
No, yeah, well, sometimes it is like that because I don't think people understand that like those two little sentences on the front and back end, we probably on average do them 3 times. Like it's just annoying. and it's the same words. We've been doing this 20 episodes now, still be struggling over them. So yes, it is. It's a personal win every time.
It's a personal win. I should have boom bam hold today because it was longer and a little bit different, and it was one hitter quitter. So bow.
We need boom hold just for the internet working today.
Yeah, it's true. Internet be hating though. I really don't get that. It's like, bitch, you everywhere. Why are you hating on us? So. And
it's still a struggle. And the thing that pisses me off, even for me on my end, I can't never figure out what it actually is. I don't know. Is it when the weather is bad? Are the other people? I have no clue.
I don't know. People don't understand like all the different stuff that just goes. Like, I'm not one of the people that's like, I work so hard. I want y'all to know I'm not.
All my life I had to fight.
But I do think, somebody that does respect labor, like there's something to be said about like having to cipher through all this shit and just give y'all 2 hours. And even when you see flaws, you don't realize like how many didn't make it. So even if we fucked up something, like there's so many things that we had to fix or tweak or, and then I once upon a time, I never suggested, I had thought about doing a whole shoot the shit on just editing, but not just from a video standpoint, but how it interacts with other types of editing. And how there's even like a slight politic to editing, like the flow of conversation and what do you leave in and how do you reflect the statement of what someone's trying to say. And, like all of that is like its own science. Like that's another episode. But I'm just saying like people think it's as simple as start and press play. And a lot of people's shows leave too much shit in. This is my opinion. Like, so it's like everything you say ain't that funny. Everything you say ain't that smart. Sometimes it's actually better to cut shit out and trim it down,
Mm-hmm. And that reminds me of like when we have certain interviews, you be like, I should have popped in because we'll just let people go and go and go and go. I'm thinking about it was one segment in particular. I won't call it out by name, but you were like, I would have, let me know if you want me to step in and cut people off next time, which it attests to like, number one, you got to go back and edit the shit after the back. And secondly, as you were saying, like everything doesn't need to go in. And sometimes you got to be like, wrap it up, my dude. So
yeah, even if it's a good take, I mean, I don't know, I learned if I'm like writing poems, like, or even writing in general, sometimes you'll have a nice line or a nice bar or, a few sentences, depending on the style, but it don't fit with the overall piece. Sometimes you just got to cut it out. Even if it was a nice like line, or like I said, even if it hits in like separately, it does not flow in the whole session of what is being said. Or what you're trying to write. So it's like, same applies to video. Sometimes somebody will say something deep, but it really doesn't fit the flow of conversation at all. Because you already made this point 5 minutes ago, so you don't need to say it again. So it's like, yeah, just little stuff like that. I don't think people think about, like we say there's too many podcasts. I just think there's too many podcasts that don't like process that. Like, everything you say isn't that important. Just don't take yourself that seriously.
With writing, fuck that. I'm leaving all my shit in. I'm putting it in a footnote. I'm leaving all my bars in. All my good shit, I'm leaving it in there. And I'll let the peer review take it out. I'm leaving all my shit in there. It's all fucking bars, magic and fairy dust. So
that's why we have editors.
Yep. It do all be bars though.
No, I'm just thinking about I think about even the times where you consciously cut the camera because there are other things, or cut the recording because there were other things that just come up in conversation all the time. So yeah, it's a lot, but it's always been fun and enjoyable and rewarding, and it was cool to go back and see, some of those things again, because I guess it was October when we started.
It's like this is a span of like 5 or 6 months. Yeah, that's the thing. We took the break. So it's like we forget hella shit. Like 20 episodes is a lot. Weekly a lot, especially with like breaks in between. So, shit look different. My chair is different. Like, when we did the first episode, we were together in Europe. So it's like shit be like Layla got a microphone, like, so like it's interesting to see like things evolve in that way too.
Yeah, the weather change.
Don't care. Yo, because that was one thing that I was looking at, the amount of times where it was nighttime on my end, and now it's actually like today. I'm just amazed. Well, we're recording a little bit earlier today, but on top of that, it's actually 70 degrees here, and it has not been 70 degrees here since I arrived in September. So I'm just in a general better mood. So
yeah, weather change. I was in hotels and shit. Just going through the footage. So it's like, especially in February. So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, the blurred background is a harbinger for travel. We know you're not in your natural habitat when it's the blurred background.
Yeah.
All right, you all. So for this week's planting thoughts, it's one of my favorites. I just got this recently, but I love this particular one. So this is an Alocasia Winty. It's also known as a New Guinea shield or a hardy elephant ear. So it's not the giant elephant ear that can get huge, but this one can get pretty big. It's grown fairly extensively in Southeast Asia. It's fairly easy to take care of. It needs a lot of bright but indirect light. And regular watering. And one of the things that I just like about this one is because they get big and they grow tall, they get big, and they're like a nice staple for the house. So this is one of those ones that gives me my jungle vibes for real. This one and the Monstera deliciosa. These are two of my favorites. So that is this week's plant for planting thoughts, the Alocasia Winty or the hardy elephant ear.
All right, y'all. So what we wanted to do for the last episode in the spirit of recapping and reflecting is each of us will go through and give a success, a segment, and self-criticism. So success is an episode of the season that we thought was great or that we really enjoyed. A segment from any episode that we thought was really, really engaging or really good. And then self-criticism in terms of an episode where we thought we could have performed better or showed up or something of that nature. So Layla will kick us off.
Okay, so for my success, it was actually our second episode of the season, and that one is a success for a number of reasons for me. I think one, I like when we're able to be physically together. So that episode I enjoyed because it was on the tail end of Sharice and I's trip to Europe. And on top of that, we were interviewing Olivia Rutazibwa, who's a close friend of mine. And I don't know, there's something about the dynamic. Obviously, I think all of our guests are great, but when the three of us know each other, when we can have a certain type of rapport, I just enjoy that, right? I don't necessarily know that it makes it better for the viewers or not, but I enjoy that. And so I like in the episodes where we're able to have a lot of banter in addition to the seriousness of the conversation. I really appreciate that. And one of the things we were talking about that particular day was genocide and epistemicide and the kind of ridiculous ways that the rest of the world has responded to some of the ways that Africa was dealing with COVID. And so I think that, when we have those types of conversations, whatever kind of levity can be brought in is nice to be there. And so I genuinely appreciated the sort of vibe and I think that conversation was also quite well-rounded because we were talking about some very, I think, concrete things in terms of COVID on the ground. But then I know Olivia's sort of larger project is thinking about epistemicide and thinking about ways of the ways that Black thought is undermined and ignored and covered up. And so I think that, for me, that was a success for all of those reasons. The segment that I enjoyed the most, again, for similar reasons, was the class in session, which was in episode 4, where we interviewed 2 of my former students. That particular segment, Ashley and Chloe, Chloe was one of my first students, like as a PhD student, and Ashley was one of the first students that I met when I got to UMass Boston in 2018, who've both gone on to graduate school. And I just really, I appreciate that it even mattered enough to them to come and have the conversation with me about what it meant to have worked together to mentor. And I'm just, for me, with my, I think of myself as a teacher. And that's something that's really important to how I understand myself in the world, and being able to see people who value what I felt like I gave was really just important and moving to me. So for me, that was one of my favorite segments. And for my self-criticism, that comes from the episode episode 6, where we did with my Uncle Bob. And the self-criticism, again, I don't even necessarily know that it mattered that much to the audience. But we typically try to have a bit more sort of dialogic style. And I know my uncle quite well, and I know the breadth and depth of experiences that he has. And so we also, we tend to send the questions to our guests ahead of time. So he had a sense of what the questions were. And so in some ways he was answering questions without us asking them. And I think on the one hand, it didn't harm anything in terms of the information, but I think in terms of our own discipline, like my criticism of myself would have been to maybe try to jump in, stop a little bit, redirect at certain points, and just to keep the sort of conversational tone that we try to have for the interviews. But in general, I think the interview was great and informative, and there's so much in it, and people should definitely go back to it. But I think I would just have not play the niece so much and been a little bit more of the show host and, interrupted. So those are mine.
So yeah, I love that. I love the episode with your Uncle Bob. I was rolling, nose red, laughing. Okay. And I feel like I try to get a few sneak attacks in there, like, so what about, you know what I mean? But you're right. Like, and it's also like just his breadth of knowledge. You don't want to really stop the flow because he be on one and then he get to drag in too. And so I'm like, say more, so like, but I completely understand it. I think that in general, just as interview technique, it just is difficult because I feel like there were other episodes where we could have hopped in and been like, so, or even dropped in the chat, like, hey, can you wrap this part up so we can move on or whatever. And so I just think I think that both you and I can sort of like do better with that. And so I appreciated that self-criticism. Of course, I loved the conversation with Olivia. In fact, the shirt that I'm wearing, this "Don't Touch Me, Peasant," came from our Europe trip. So we went to some show in Amsterdam. And so like, I just have very fond memories of like our first and second episode, because the first episode was there too, and of that trip. And, and Olivia is great. And so it's good. There is just a different vibe being in conversation with like people that we both know. I felt the same with Keto to a certain extent, you know what I mean? I'll talk about this in my thing, but when there's just a particular vibe. Sometimes it's more formal when it's like scholars that we don't necessarily know, or that one of us knows, or have a different type of relationship. But when it's like the homie, like it's a really good conversation. So I appreciate it.
I think that t-shirt
and
came
I love
from
meeting
the
Chloe.
Torture Museum.
Yeah, in Amsterdam, right?
Yeah, from the Torture Museum.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Yes, you're
Torture, never mind.
Yeah, it's from our trip to the Torture Museum. So we had this little Traders Gonna Trade and this ridiculous picture that y'all about to see. The light is really bright.
Oh, that's yours.
Terrible. Yes.
Hold on. Let me go grab mine, because that's not even the craziest, the most ridiculous one. Hold up. Yeah. So this is the very ridiculous one. Yeah. So we had a blast. But anyway, I appreciated those everything that you pointed out.
Yeah, and I think that the first episode that you were talking about, Olivia, like I think that it indirectly inspired the episode we did on Black Myths later about whether Omicron or Omarion, whatever the fuck people want to call it, whether that originated in Africa or South Africa. But we got to talk about like different ways that people, because I remember I went back and reviewed that episode a little bit before we did that one, the myth, but like different ways that Africans dealt with COVID and how that way of knowing is dismissed. And then also had me thinking about, even once the conversation about like donating vaccines came up, there was still kind of a liberal like blind spot there, thinking that you could just donate these vaccines to these countries and they would just take them when they have no reason to trust the West, you know. And they also have been able to survive the situation. It's not to say that they don't need vaccines, but what they really need is their ability to develop their own technology and to develop their own medicine and not be dependent upon the West. So in that episode, I think helped me think about that, because I don't even think I really thought about it that much up to that point. So I appreciated that. As well as the piece that you wrote, Layla, we used that on the, we actually referenced that on the episode.
Okay. So for my little rundown, all right. So for my success, it was episode 15. This was our interview with Yannick Marshall. And you want to talk about vibes. We just was vibing, y'all, even though there was sort of points of productive tension when we was like, what is you saying about organizing for real, my guy? Like, I think that the conversation in general, his affect and his vibe just very much matched with Layla and I in terms of how we feel about academia, how we feel about Pan-Africanism, how we feel about Black people and what is to be done, right? And so it just was a really dope conversation. And that whole episode in general, not just that interview, I really enjoyed. Number one, I was wearing my Dino sweatshirt, which was dope. We had my student Jorge Banuelos on for a second time. So I had him on in season 1, and then we had him on in season 2. And I just am so proud of him. He's so smart and talented, and it just was great to sort of catch up with him and see how he's doing in his first year of graduate school. So proud of you, Jorge. I know you watch. And then also our shoot the shit about benign settler colonialism, which again was drawing on the thought of Yannick Marshall. I just thought the whole episode kind of had a connective tissue, which I really like. I really like when we can have like thematic episodes where things kind of flow throughout. So I really, really enjoyed both that interview and then the whole episode in general. So just my very quick runner-up is the very special episode with Keto Swan. That would have been my favorite, but because it was a very special episode, I wanted to pick like a regular one from the season. But again, as Layla was speaking about, our vibe with Olivia, it was the same with Keto. We both know Keto. We love Keto, respect his work. We're all Black studies scholars. And so I really, really enjoyed that one. So go watch it. It did not get the views I think it should have gotten. So go watch it. Okay, in terms of my segment, I really, really loved the History of the Present segment from episode 17 with Dev and Darian. I really enjoyed the quote. It was a long quote. So we weren't expecting for that segment to go on as long as it did, but like we really couldn't cut the quote down. It was a quote from Argelia Laya, that Layla picked, and it was about socialism. And then we got to talk about socialism, feminism, Venezuela, patriarchy, all sorts of themes we were able to pull out from that quote. And so I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed the insights that Dev and Darian provided, of course, and just having like a different vibe, just being in conversation and having sort of like a round table was really cool and really interesting. So, and that's part one to this episode, which is part 2 in terms of our engagement with Dev and Darian. So for my self-criticism, it is episode 7 with Brianna Joy Gray. Now, I think that there was a disjuncture between our affect with her in the interview and then what ended up happening in the chat. So I think that the thing is, when we're going through the interview, I think that we do, and this was earlier on in the season, I feel like as we went through the season, we kind of pushed back more. But I think that we, knowing like our different sort of political orientations, we didn't necessarily want to bully her, especially because there's two of us. And also, like, when we're doing interviews, we're also doing other things. We're communicating with each other in the chat in terms of like keeping time and all these other things. And so sometimes we miss things. And so what happens is when we're in the chat and we're replaying the episode, then we're really watching and it's like, the fuck? And then, it's the chat. The chat is more our political orientation. And so it just kind of felt between like our commentary, particularly mine, and then that of other viewers, it kind of felt like a pile on. And so Brianna and I had a relatively, I would say, like cordial relationship prior. And it's not that it's smoke now, but it certainly is not the same. And so I think that that's unfortunate, right? Like, I think that there was just kind of like a miscommunication, or there just was some kind of different expectations. The way that I was received on her show, because I had gone on her show previously. And I think that the way that I was received on her show is what she thought would be reciprocated. And I think that in the interview portion, I think it was to a certain degree. But in the chat, it's like we have very particular viewers with a very particular political orientation. And so in terms of self-criticism, I think that perhaps a conversation could have been had before. Like, I could have had a conversation with her before about the nature of the show, and also like maybe pushing more in the interview so there was more consonance between the show and the chat, or maybe in retrospect, probably maybe just not letting the bombs drop in the chat. And so I just think, even though we have different political perspectives, I really think it is good to build bridges across the broad left. And so it just kind of feels like, oh man, like that relationship won't be the same, and there won't be the same types of opportunities. And so that's a self-criticism, is sort of being more mindful of just the sort of wraparound of having people on the show, how we engage with them on the show, how we engage with them in the chat, and then also preparing them to come on to a radical Pan-African socialist show. So so those are mine.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing with Brianna Joy Gray, we talked about this, and I in terms of what our kind of vision for this show was, is that, we're not trying to do like, what do you call it?
Gotcha.
We're not trying to do gotcha journalism, right? The way that I understood it, the way we talked about it after the fact, is that, okay, we want to showcase the work of people who inform our own thinking, who are doing important work. And so like, it's not meant to have people come on and be combative, right? And so that was part of the conversation that we had. And I think that that's what we do. Like, I think Brianna Joy Gray is probably the one outlier. And she's not that bad, but she's the one outlier in terms of our guests and hosts that are with outside of the sort of political purview, our political purview, right? And so I think we had some follow-up conversations about how we wanted to approach that going forward in terms of what types of guests we would have, who we would invite on, and the type of works we would showcase. And I think that, I think we've done that, since then. And I think it's, it's an important thing to be able to sort of criticize. I second the vibes with Yannick. I did not know Yannick. I don't know. See, I know Two Black, Yannick was your guest suggestion, but the way that we vibed was similar to the way I think other guests that we all know collectively we vibe. So I really, really, really did enjoy that. Even in spite of some of the productive tensions around certain questions, I was really only one.
And I guess
that was really it. But I really did enjoy that particular interview. And I'm grateful to Two Black for me, because I wasn't that familiar with Yannick prior to that. And so I'm grateful to you for introducing me to him, and I'm happy that we were able to introduce him to our audience, whoever didn't already know him. I don't particularly enjoy talking to the camera by myself, but I always enjoy the segments or the conversations that allow us to have these kind of back and forths. I like talking to people, and I really appreciated Devin Darian's own perspective, own perspectives as I think people who are quite well versed in feminisms outside of the US. And I think that this has been a productive tension for Sharice and I think that conversation really highlighted some of what I think Sharice understands. And, you know, it made it clear to me the distinctions between what gets pumped out as feminism and feminist propaganda in the US context versus what a feminism that comes out of, you know, these kind of productive struggles for socialism, for communism in Latin America and the Caribbean and Africa. And so I really appreciated that particular portion of that conversation.
And you know what's crazy is like Dev and Darian are like light-skinned, queer Muslim, Sharice and Layla. I would say Dev is like me and Darian is more like you in terms of affects and in terms of like just disposition. Like they're like our doppelganger, our groundings doppelgangers.
I think so. I agree.
I'll work in the same order. I think I always want to say her name wrong. I watch too much Game of Thrones. So I think even in the original, because I'll get to that because I fucked that episode up. But in the original like clip, or not clip, but in the original thumbnail online, I think it said Brianna Greyjoy. You know, and Greyjoy is a name from Game of Thrones, for those who don't know. But like Brianna Joy Gray. But I think with that interview, like. I think some of it, looking back though, some of it was political differences, but I think some of it was the fact that she wasn't there to talk about anything specific. And this is not a criticism of her; it's just what it was. So I'm saying, like, some people probably will be more attention if they weren't talking directly about their book, talking about some of the people we've had on the show. But since they're talking about what's in their book, and y'all go through the book, you find the things that you're interested in talking about, and then you kind of find a ground there. With her, I mean, she does have writings, but you're talking more expansive when you're talking about dating on the left, and you're talking about political strategies. So the conversation just went places that it doesn't typically go unless it's just us talking. It doesn't typically go all those places, especially on like political strategy and stuff like that. So I think that was just a different terrain. And I think that might have made it a little bit more complicated as opposed to when you bring someone on to talk about Rastafarianism in Tanzania. Like, this is a very specific topic that you can get into, right? Like, but hers was like all over, like different topics. Again, this is not a shot, just to clarify that once again. I'm just saying, like, it's just different because she has a different function. Like, she's coming in from a comms background. She's not coming in as like a scholar, like a lot of the guests that we speak to. She's an author, but not necessarily a scholar in the same sense. So I think that it's just interesting how interviews, like just little stuff, can like throw it in a different direction, and then the response can be, oh, like people didn't agree with her or whatever. But like, I'm just, a lot of times I think things are just how things happen because of how we format stuff. So I think like thinking back on that sometimes is good. I don't know. I think just in the topic itself, like Black radical women, I think it was nice to see that and then not be the kind of, you know, the way a lot of Women History Month has been going, where, you know, it's just like, we're just going to lift up pom-poms for whatever kind of girl boss type. And then that's the end of the conversation. You know, and then
we was going to have a Black girl magic conversation.
Yeah. You know, I just think that was helpful. As far as the Yannick conversation, I mean, yeah, that's my man. As far as I just always rock with his writing, I appreciate the way he integrates, you know, a different type of style into that kind of theory. We don't really get that anymore. Like he kind of has the Fanonian style to him in a way, you know, that he's able to kind of carry through it. And you don't really get that as much anymore, you know. But he's still able to speak, you know, specifically to certain topics. So I always just appreciate his work, you know, just on that front. And then he's just hilarious. Like, he's just straight up, you know. so he talks in ways that, you know, you don't really always get to hear from people that are in those positions. Like, he's just very honest about the fact that a lot of these things are bullshit, and that he thinks they're bullshit and he's struggling through it. And, you know, you get to see that in real time versus, you know, he's not trying to put any kind of real polished things. I think there's a part where he said, I'm probably the worst academic ever, you know, or I remember he's told me before, like, he don't even like some of the stuff he's written, he's like, I should probably be writing a book, but these people just get on my nerves, so I just keep writing these think pieces, you know, like I just keep writing these essays because these people like black liberals and stuff, these people just get on my nerves. So, you know, and that's how I originally found his work. He was talking about black liberal, your time is up, and that just said everything I think that needed to be said at that time. So yeah. All right, so for my episode, I kind of split it. So I'm a fan of like, and maybe this is my blackness background. Like I'm a fan of like, you know, when the team can come together and do an episode and it doesn't have to be carried or by a guest and it still does well as far as the views or whatever. So there's 2 particular episodes we did on the second half of the season. We did one with the Dr. Martin Luther King episode. And then we did the one to Glenn Ford. The one to Glenn Ford got a lot of love, not as much on the Dr. King one. But I thought the Dr. King one was good because we really got to like, we actually engaged Dr. King beyond just, oh, he was radical and they're trying to tear him down. Like everybody does that. This is, when we were having our meeting, I said that like everyone in our world does that every year. You know, have fun. So I just wanted, it was just nice to do something where we really engaged his work. We disagreed with him. We agreed. We even thought we were materialists in the way we understood stuff. So even when we were talking about his words in 1963 and the radicals at that time weren't as strong as they were in like maybe say 65 or 66 or 68 when he's assassinated. And you know, I think the conversation on holidays was good because me and CBS pretty close in this as far as we don't really have much love for like, you know, kind of monumenting things. So it's like, but even that disagreement that we had a little bit on these things was good. And I just think that was an episode that's the one I would say go back and watch. Because I think we did a really good job of, you know, giving context to that time. And like I said, what I mean by engage Dr. King, like we actually read his words and had thoughts on them beyond trying to like claim him as this radical figure or beat him up. It was just like, no, what did the man say? What was he up against? What were the conditions? And, you know, what was he dealing with? What were people at the time dealing with? And I think we need more of that on this so-called black left, as opposed to trying to turn people into heroes or villains. I think we just need to engage people's shit. And that's one thing I appreciate about this show, particularly on these episodes. So like I said, with Glenn Ford, I'm not going to speak as much on that because more people clearly watched it, but whoever hasn't watched it, I would say watch it. You know, Glenn Ford was, you know, the founder and editor of the Black Agenda Report, one of the co-founders and editor of Black Agenda Report. And the book, The Black Agenda, came out this year. So as another time we got to engage a book, engage work, and go through his essays and see how he was actually ahead in many ways of predicting, you know, prophetic in many ways of predicting how the predicaments that we're in today. As far as segment, it was in episode 9, I believe, the history of the president. We talked, it was Emil Cabral, the weapon of theory. And again, I just like engaging text. Like I'm a nerd, so that's the part I always enjoy. Like I like deep dive shit. Again, this is my black myths part coming out. I like the deep dive. So that was fun to not only just, again, what it gets on my nerves is people just block quote people. So we didn't just talk about class suicide. We were able to go through the whole, it was a speech that he was giving, actually. We were able to go over the whole thing, you know, and put class suicide in context versus when people turn it, like I think we said in the conversation, a lot of times people turn class suicide into class privilege and like denouncing your privilege. And it's not the same thing. And I don't need to break that down. We'll just go watch that episode, but it's not the same thing. They're actually not even really that close. So it's just like, I think that was good. And then self-criticism, we talked about the Breonna Joy Gray episode, but there's no record of this, thankfully. Like I erased it from memory. But the editing on that episode for me was awful. Like I spent way too much time trying to get one particular feature right, and then the rest of the things the things I typically catch, I didn't catch. So because she wasn't on screen, so I was trying to create like a kind of a graphic to still make it look like she was talking, and I just got so focused on that, like the most basic shit. So that if you would have saw the original episode, probably half the bloopers that were at the beginning were in that episode, but I just left them in because it just wasn't a good week. So, I mean, I'm pretty critical of myself anyway. So at that point, that's why immediately once I realized that I took it down, apologized or whatever. But like, but it just reminded me, to always watch the shit and always check the opening and beginning of every segment. That's something I made that's an adjustment I made. I always check the opening and beginning because that's where most of the shit went wrong. Was just the opening and beginning. So always checking that, making sure that part is clean, and then
Yeah, I remember you in the chat. I mean, it was quasi funny because you were in the chat like brick, brick, and then you were like, "There's like 4 more," and I was like, "Oh no!" There was literally 4 more. So that was like a glitch in the matrix, but it's all good. Like, shit happens. So yeah, but that whole episode was just like it was just a struggle all the way around. I enjoyed that segment. I thought that segment was literally on class suicide, and we brought in the weapon of theory, and then because we also talked about like Rodney and some other people,
and Krumah too.
And
Krumah, I wrote weapon of theory down as a reference for me. I accidentally said it as you're correct. It was on class suicide, but we mainly did talk about Cabral, but we did have Fanon and other quotes in there too.
Yep. You brought Fanon. So, but the point, I think that's your point. Having class, we put class suicide in context. So it's not just a soundbite to Cabral. Many people were talking about it in different ways. That was our point. And that it's not, as you were saying, it's not just about naming your class privilege. It is a material commitment. It's a political commitment. And it's really important. And I also enjoyed how like we, particularly Layla and I, brought it into like our own sort of orientation toward what does it mean to sort of commit class suicide as academics, as part of the petty bouge, right? And it's not, it's a process. It's ongoing. So I really enjoyed that discussion as well. And then I agree. Like, I really enjoy the episodes where we can chop it up. Like, I'm not a huge fan of interview after interview. I don't mind. And I think that it's more so the interview format. I think if we had more conversational tone with people that we brought on, like, I think it would be a little bit different. But even still, like, I think we're smart. I trust our analysis. I think we have great things to say, just like the 3 of us. And so like, I particularly enjoy when we're just able to like run it. That's even when I was thinking about having a podcast, I was sort of like more so my vision than having an interview show, because I know that when I listen to podcasts, I really I don't really listen to interviews that much. Like, I like the segments. So there's this random podcast I listen to called Happier with Gretchen Rubin. Like, I like the segments where Gretchen and Elizabeth, they're 2 sisters, they co-host, when they're just chopping it up and they do their own thing, and then they'll have guests from time to time. And so that is what sort of like I envisioned for LDI. And then it morphed into, I think, more interview focus, because there's just people writing dope shit, and there's just hella people to talk to expose the audience to. But so I think I also enjoy the times where it's just us like talking shit. And that's why I especially enjoy like Shoot the Shit, because it's just us exchanging ideas and analyzing. So appreciate all of those.
Yeah, I mean, I know on both of these things, I'm a little bit of the outlier. I do like the interview format, and then even for the folks that I talk to who watch the show, they often tell me that that's what they look for. They're looking for the interviews. And for me, I think it's maybe it's a selfish thing, because it is a process of learning and engaging with me in a way that I don't feel like I really get to do at this stage of academia. Like, being a doctoral student, as much as there were things that got on my nerves, there was something about the collective reading, the discussing, the classroom environment that I found productive for me. And so for me, the interviews recapture that in a way. And so I really do appreciate those. And even the outlier on the King thing, I know that I'm the person. For me, I don't I think the segment that we did was no more holidayfication. And I just firmly believe that, you take advantage of the opportunities that you have to have those conversations, which is what we did with that episode. And so I definitely appreciated that conversation. And I mean, I do like the, when we have the ability to, in particular, like that conversation on class suicide, and we were able to think Fanon, Cabral, and Nkrumah together. And I think that, those are always productive tensions. So, I agree with that. But to your point that you made earlier, to Black, about the Brianna Joy Gray episode, which was less about your editing and more about, I honestly hadn't actually really thought about that. That because we are almost always bringing somebody to talk about a particular topic or a particular book or something that they've written, that it really does shape the nature of the conversation, and that the conversation that we had with her was much more wide ranging. And so it lent itself to a different set of issues that don't necessarily surface in other conversations, because obviously, like, we're human beings. We're not going to all agree on everything as people get invited on the show. But I do think that is an important thing to think about. Another important distinction between what happened with that particular interview and what typically happens, I think, with the other interviews. So, I just appreciate you pointing that out.
Yeah, I think normally people get quoted, and and I mean, giving people, I'm sure y'all are the same. Like, when you read somebody's stuff, like, you highlight the stuff that you're interested in. Like, so if you're on bullshit in chapter 4, I just may not ask you about that, but so it's like, but it's different when I'm talking to you and I'm just giving you the floor to talk about a subject matter, and I haven't really read your work. I don't know where it's going, or, like, it's just, I don't know, it's just like sometimes those underpinnings do play out. Like, they have a larger impact on the conversation sometimes than how people might experience it once they see it, like that's why formatting, I think, is so important.
Yeah, and I think that I agree. Also, I think that the majority of the conversation was fine. And I think the majority of the conversation was all of the conversation was predicated on what we know about her politics. I just think, yeah, I just think it was just a response to the politics. You know what I mean? And again, like, what I think about Brianna Joy Gray is that she's as far left as one can go when one believes in electoral politics. And I think that that's an important position, because that's where the overwhelming majority of our people are, right? And so it was an important conversation to have. And I do think we were, but it seems like she thought we were much closer aligned politically. And so I don't know. I just, I think that to the point that Layla made a little bit earlier, I think having people who share our politics is probably the best way, and in a sort of are more aligned with our politics. It's just a little bit easier to navigate, or, to the sort of what I was trying to think through is, like, if we are going to have people who are more sort of like left liberal or whatever that's called, is to sort of have them watch an episode of the show and then or be like, okay, this is the conversation that we're going to have. Here is the response. So I don't know. I think it was a good learning moment. And I don't regret having her on the show. I just feel like it could have been executed better. And, like, I take, like, again, self-criticism, I take responsibility for that, because I was the one who had the primary relationship with her. I had been on her show, and there was just more, I think, maybe conversation that should have been had. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think any of the interviews were bad, just for people listening. But but I'm just saying, I don't know, like, another thing we talk to people about with books, like, there's also, like, a kind of, like, established talking points that they have because, they've been researching it. She had established talking points too. And I think that this isn't a criticism this is actually looking at it the other way. Like, I think y'all kind of broke up some of her established talking points. Like, I mean, we all have done interviews to varying extents. We all have our kind of crutch things we talk about. And then every once in a while you talk to somebody who doesn't literally let you just lean on that crutch, and you got to be able to adjust. And that can cause tension, And I think that's kind of what happened is, if you usually are the most left person in a conversation and then you're not, like, that's that's a different dynamic. And I think that's what happened with her. You know, she wasn't the most far left person. So then she pivoted somewhere else, and then that caused the, you know, attention, for better or worse, right?
Mm-hmm. What happened in another conversation that we had? I won't point it out specifically, but like in terms of like people offering up talking points and then they're not getting used to like pushback or like any type of response to those talking points. Yeah, I think that's really a astute observation, that when there's any sort of pushback, then it can throw people off, like, you know, because they're not used to, because of the nature of the types of interviews that are done, which is why I appreciated Stephanie's comment about like, you know, and I guess maybe other people have said it, but I just remember Stephanie in particular about like the thought that goes into the questions that we ask. And, you know, Monique jokingly called them essays, but, you know, and they're not, it's just kind of like, you know, but I just think that they are different types of questions that we ask, given the nature of our politics, given what we're interested in. And then also like, I don't like the talking points. Like I want to have like a real conversation, you know? So anywho, great season.
All right, everybody. And continuing with our theme, focusing on Black radical women, we have decided to have a roundtable on our top 5 dead or alive. So this is a segment where we will discuss our top 5 Black radical women, dead or alive, and talk about why we think they're important.
So y'all, before we kick off this amazing, what I know is just going to be a dope, excellent, amazing conversation, let's just make it clear, like, what does radical or revolutionary mean to us when we're thinking about these Black women and what makes them radical? Like, why is it that we might choose a Claudia Jones and not a Condoleezza Rice, right? So, okay, so Layla, do you want to start?
Sure. For me, even more than radical revolutionary is the important thing, is because these women are challenging the very foundations of society in which we exist, right? They are, and I mean, and yes, in a futurist kind of way, but not in the sci-fi futurist way, but they are envisioning a way of us being full and entire human beings. That's what it is for me.
I think for me, I need people to understand, whenever I say revolutionary, I mean someone is anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, anti-colonial. Those are the 3 big ones. And of course, underneath all of those, or I don't want to say underneath because I'm not necessarily making a hierarchical statement, but emanating from those comes patriarchy, comes cis heterosexism, and all of those different things. And so for me, it's like, what's your anti-colonial stance? How do you feel about capitalism? You need, like, revolutionary to me is someone who is actively or has actively engaged in work for politically revolutionary means, right? Like you want to institute a new society based on socialism, communism, decolonization, anti-imperialism, et cetera, et cetera.
Pan-Africanism.
Pan-Africanism all day, every day.
Like
For me, all those things I said are Pan-Africanism. For me, it's like already included, a guarantee, you know?
I guess for me, I would say I don't have too much to add to that. I would say like I'm closely aligned with what both Deb and Layla said, but definitely the thing is you have to be engaged in praxis. So there has to be some sort of theory of change. You have to have some ideological framework, and you have to be putting that into practice and struggling, not only so yes, you're anti-capitalist, but what are you for? Because there could be anti-capitalists who are for fascism, right? And so when we're talking about radical and revolutionary, it is people who have a project of world making, right? That is based on what we call in that people-centered human rights. So, and animals and shit too, but people-centered human rights though, for real.
Not animals and shit. I think representation is the end all be all. Like when I see Black faces in high places, that's just it for me. Like that's the transformation I need. I mean, you know, I'm last. Y'all said everything that needed to be said. I agree. Like, you know, folks whose work invites us to dismantle all the systems that subjugate us, and or leads us to build something else, a transformed set of relationships. that, you know, affirm our lives, affirm our ability to, as Layla said, like be whole human beings. So y'all did that. Thank you for that.
So I think I'm going to kick it off. So obviously, we spent a good deal of time in the last segment talking about Argelia life. So I won't spend too much time on her, but I did just want to give a basic few things. So she was born in 1926 in Venezuela. She ends up dying in 1997. I think I mentioned that both of her parents were militants. Her mother was a member of the Women's Cultural Assembly, and her father was a guerrilla fighter that fought in the country from the late 19th century to the early 20th century. As a younger woman, she joined the Women's Union, the Unión de Muchachas, which was a legal organization of the Communist Party in Venezuela at the time. I think I also already mentioned that she, at 19, and this is one of her, I think, kind of formative moments. At 19, she was raped, got pregnant, and took up responsibility for raising her child herself, and standing up against a possible dismissal from her job as a teacher due to immorality, because of her decision to keep her child. She was initially a member of Acción Democrática, which was I guess a more left centrist organization inside of Venezuela, but later on left to join the Communist Party. She played an active role in the resistance against the dictator Marco Pérez Jiménez, and she was an organizer of the Women's Patriotic Board and helped to actually lead the general strike of 1958, and which ultimately resulted in the overthrow of Pérez Jiménez. She later became known as Comandante Jacinta, and that was from her guerrilla fighting stages. And she, you know, as you already know, she was a fierce defender of women to be treated as equals both inside the party and at large. And she was later an active contributor to the founding and early organization of the Black Women's Union. And in one of her last public pieces of writing, which was in 97, the year that she passed, she talks about herself as a social advocate for true democracy, for justice, peace, and for women's cause, and for all human rights, and that she was always going against the tide. She said, "I could move forward side by side with women and men with whom I'd shared both luck and struggle. Struggling against racism and patriarchy always means swimming against the tide because they are deeply rooted in our subjectivities and what cultures define as common sense." And that is Argelia Laya.
Well, I think anyone listening to this knows that the past few months, maybe past year, I've been on this really big Safiya Bukhari kick because I am rereading her work, her book, The War Before. And when I first read it, I was just very politically underdeveloped and like, you know, I didn't have the same intellectual tools and resources and all that I have now. And I'm realizing that she is the shit. Everything she says is extremely relevant, is dope as fuck. She understands things like imperialism, neocolonialism being like the main contradictions in the world, and she breaks it down to an atomic level, how that system and structure affects us in our interpersonal and daily lives. And she has this analysis that is so militant. Safiya Bukhari is also special for me because she's a Black Muslim woman, and myself being a Black Muslim, you know, it's always great to find these luminaries. And there's actually there's several essays in her book, The War Before, but there's one on which she discusses, it says, "We too are veterans of a war." And she's talking about how during the Black liberation struggle of the 60s and 70s, veterans were created who have PTSD, who check their doors, make sure their doors are locked, have security protocols, who, you know, have to make sure that no one's looking outside their windows or searching through their cars, and have to go to the underground. And when they hear loud noises, they get, you know, scared or PTSD. And so she's making these analyses that we make now and feel so cutting edge and new, and like we think we're doing something new, but she was saying this shit decades ago. And she was articulating it better than any of these contemporary, well, no shade to the room, but academic folks, you know what I mean? Like, and so Safiya Bukhari, I just feel, you know, the militant spirit that she has, and she merges in there a gender analysis, always a critique of capitalism and imperialism. She was a Black Panther, Black Liberation Army member. When she was incarcerated twice, and she escaped from prison twice. And she actually saw, to be quick, but I'll give a little info. She was a disabled person. She had issues with her reproductive system, and she escaped prison because the care she was getting was inadequate, and she was going to die basically with the prison's care. And so she used that as her means to escape. She says it was a pact between her and Allah that if she wanted to survive, she would have to become a runaway slave. And when she was recaptured and returned in the court, she actually used that to discuss all of the women at the prison and women who were all being denied care or getting poor care. She tells a story of one woman who needed one surgery, and she went into the operating room and got the wrong surgery, literally. And so she actually used her disability to fight for like the rights of all the women in prisons, and ended up winning her case and got the prison like a new doctor, better care protocols and all that. So anyways, I'll stop there, but Sophia Bukhari is like, she's at the top of my list for sure.
She's giving Claudia Jones in that moment, the sort of using her medical condition to struggle on behalf of all women. All right, so I want to lift up Margaret Kimberly for my first woman. And Margaret Kimberly wrote this book, Presidential, Black America and the Presidents. And so this book, so I'll say more about Margaret Kimberly more broadly, but this book is really important because we like to try to order the presidents from best to worst. And basically what she points out in this book is that they're all fucking trash. There wasn't a one of them that wasn't racist. There wasn't a one of them that was intent on reproducing US imperialism and US domination, and capitalism, imperialism, racism, war, all that stuff, right? And so she goes through and shows in very sort of clear language, but very powerful language, how this is the case. And so there's no lesser evil. They're all trash. But Margaret Kimberly is really, really important. She's the editor at the Black Agenda Review and the Black Agenda Report. And a few weeks ago, we did our episode on Glenn Ford. And, Glenn Ford was one of her mentors, and she's very much taken on his sort of no holds barred, powerful, incisive, fearless analysis with Black Agenda Report. And since his passing, she has, she's at the helm of Black Agenda Report and continues to deliver that same top-notch information. I particularly want to lift up the work that she's been doing around the Ukraine situation. As we know, we got a lot of goofy motherfuckers, many of them Africans, many of them Black folks, peddling State Department lines, peddling the imperialist line, peddling this played out in ahistorical Cold War USSR narrative. But as always, Black Agenda Report and Margaret Kimberly in particular remain clear and anti-imperialist and anti-war in her analysis. So one of the pieces is called Terrell Starr and Black Support of Imperialism. This one dropped on February 16, 2022. And Terrell Starr is the goofiest of the coon imperialists at this moment, okay? So please read this piece and please read her critique of why it is that he is caping for empire at this moment and where who's funding him, whose interests he is promoting, etc. The second piece is she wrote on January 26, 2022, or was published on January 26, and it's called Ukraine and US War Propaganda. This is really important to understand it's really important to read that piece and to understand this particular perspective on this Ukraine conflict, because it did not start 2 weeks ago. It did not start a month ago. It did not even start in 2014 when the US propped up this neo-fascist government in Ukraine. It started even well before that. So the NATO, US, EU axis of domination is the problem. We're not riding Putin's nuts or anything like that. It's important to understand what the actual correlation of forces are. And as always, with, from the Iraq conflict to Afghanistan to Yugoslavia, to many, many other global conflicts. Margaret Kimberly has always laid it out and made it plain, even when her and Glenn and Bruce Dixon were the only ones with that position, they still were steadfast. Even in their critique of Obama, Obama was president, mind you, at the time when they installed this right-wing government in Ukraine. So anyway, Margaret Kimberly, if you're going to read nobody else, I think you should read widely. But if you read nobody else, not only on the Ukraine situation, but if you want to get that real deal, Holyfield, anti-imperialist, Pan-African, anti-war analysis, it's Margaret Kimberly, period.
And I just hop in to be petty real quick because this Terrell J. Star mother. Can I cuss on here? I don't know.
You don't watch our show. Go ahead, Darian. Deb don't watch LDI.
I'm sorry. Look, I used to work in the news television. I'm always thinking if I can cuss or not. But that whole, you can go back in the archive and look, his Twitter bio changes every time there's a conflict. He used to be a Korea's expert. Then he was a nuclear expert all of a sudden. Now he is a Russian and Ukraine expert. So that right there is the red flag people should notice. Why are you an expert every single time the Atlantic Council sends you somewhere, you're suddenly an expert? And so I just wanted to point that out there. He has a long track record, a history of all of us hating him. So anyways, go there, my bad.
Coon imperialist. Add it to your vocabulary.
It's such a succinct and useful term too. It just kind of captures everything. I want to maybe start off by saying the names and the lives and the work that I bring into this space are selected because of my training. Like, I'm an urban planner. I think about land when I think about revolution, when I think about experimentation, when I think about political struggle. I am trying to figure out my piece in what does it look like to apply an idea to space and to land and to resources. And I think first I want to bring up Naima Muhammad, who is of the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. A little preface, there are certain academics who don't do bad work, who might call themselves the parent or the father of environmental justice or environmental justice movement, Robert Bullard of Texas. However, the movement started, or rather I should say, it started using that term in North Carolina, in Warren County, specifically because of the work of organized Black women who were struggling against manufacturers dumping PCB waste in Warren County, and it was poisoning Black folks out there. And specifically groups of people who were connecting that very local struggle to regional economic development, to how the federal government was incentivizing certain manufacturers to use certain kinds of land near Black folks and near indigenous communities in North Carolina. And folks like Naima Muhammad come out of that lineage of struggle in North Carolina, connecting conditions in neighborhoods to national global struggles, to global supply chains, and to resisting colonial project expansion. And Naima Muhammad is iconic to me because as a master's student, sitting in an environmental justice class, she came in and spoke to a group of, 5 or 6 students about how she applies her analysis to ongoing conditions in North Carolina. And I remember one student asking, like, so what are you, like, what kind of framework are you operating from? Like, how do you not just treat these as like pet issues, running from one struggle to another, from one episode to another? And she just laughed and said, well, first of all, I'm a communist. And and before I even became introduced to the very Rodneyist tradition of being a guerrilla intellectual, and I know there's experts in this space on that, Naima Muhammad modeled for me collaborative relationships with researchers, mostly Steve Wing of University of North Carolina. He's passed on since a few years ago. getting people involved in doing the work and acknowledging the stakes. So not just observing Black suffering, but Naima Muhammad's work led researchers to do public health research, urban planning research across North Carolina, which is arguably still a plantocracy run by industrial hog operations who create atmospheres and regimes of fear and stifle political imagination across small towns, specifically in Eastern North Carolina. Folks just testing water, folks just testing air and soil, getting sued, getting threatened, getting shot at in an effort to not just improve the lives of Black folks living in towns across Eastern North Carolina, but to transform relationships with land and to unseat people in power. And so I'm doing this a little bit out of order. So just to kind of set the stage, there's industrial hog operation across North Carolina if you eat pork, which, you know, some of us don't. But if you do, you're connected to that supply chain in like a very direct way. The hog manufacturers or the hog meat manufacturers have these huge lagoons of hog waste. It's just pig shit sitting in these like enormous ponds across the landscape of North Carolina. In and of themselves, they're toxic, seep into, you know, water, soil. You see elevated risk of cancer, incidence of cancer, of respiratory issues. Every time a hurricane strikes North Carolina, which is pretty often, second only to Florida, hurricanes wash pig shit into Black folks' homes and communities. And for a really long time, as folks were trying to organize against that, they would just be threatened, or you know, a corporation might say, we'll pull out of your town and you'll have no jobs, or folks would just get shot at. And so folks like Naima Muhammad formed coalitions across Black communist farmers in Eastern North Carolina. Other Black folks who didn't think of themselves as inhabiting political spaces, as well as the indigenous folks of North Carolina, often the Lumbee tribe, in directly resisting this regime of planters, of hog farmers, of corporations. And so I just want to bring her up because she's cool. She's still around doing work with the Environmental Justice Network. And there's still a lot of battles to be fought currently. I mean, the hog operations are still there, but also like Duke Energy cites coal ash waste facilities near waterways and kind of has similar effects, respiratory, cancer. And yeah, and there's a place for everybody in this work.
So just as an aside, Darian, what's your North Carolina connection?
What's my North Carolina connection?
Are you from North Carolina?
I'm not from North Carolina.
Okay, I was just curious.
I lived there for a few years, and I went to school there, and I worked as an urban planner for Black towns in Eastern North Carolina. So
no, I was just thinking, I'm from North Carolina and live in Boston now.
Raleigh.
That's where I'm from. No, well, I really was just thinking the North Carolina and Boston connection for both of us. That's really what was going through my mind. But anyway, thank you for all that. Okay, so my next person is Mabel Dove Dankwa. So she's a Ghanaian writer, journalist, activist, born in the Gold Coast at the time. And she, like I said, but so one of the things that's interesting about her, I think, is that she is an example of a person who has, you know, attempted a form of her own revolutionary class suicide. Right? She was born to a relatively well-off family. She ends up going away to school in Sierra Leone. And I also think that that's important because of the way that she develops her own understanding of Pan-Africanism, right? And I think that that's important as we think about people who are moving across the continent and thinking about the shared connections and the shared nature of oppression and what it means to live as African people under colonization on the continent. Like I said, she was born to fairly well-off parents. But she enters into politics relatively early in the 50s, before Ghana's independence. She became the first woman to be elected to a member of any African legislative assembly. But later on, slightly before that, she gets involved with the Convention People's Party, which is a socialist organization in Ghana at the time. She becomes a member of the staff of the nationalist Accra Evening News. And she joins the campaign to end British rule and starts demanding sort of immediate self-governance for the Gold Coast. And so it's clear that prior to her involvement because she becomes involved with Nkrumah, she already has her own sort of burgeoning politics, and her way of sort of her outlet for doing this is through writing. She also does some creative writing. Actually, she does a lot of creative writing, but she's a journalist by profession. And so her involvement, and actually one of the things when she was writing for the Accra Evening News, she actually got into a dispute with Nkrumah over editing processes and how things should take place. And she ends up leaving that, right? And I think that that's important too, to think about the fact that as much as she had respect for Nkrumah as a leader, versus she still had her own fighting spirit, and she understood her own ways of doing and going about things. And she was willing to stand on those things, even if it meant losing her job, right? In the general election of 1954, she was committed to organizing women of the Convention People's Party and was subsequently put up as a CPP candidate for the Ga Rural constituency, which she won. And her election made her the first female member of the Legislative Assembly of the Gold Coast. She continues to write over the course of the rest of her life. Some of her fiction and nonfiction works are The Happening of the Night, which was these are earlier in 31, The Adventures of a Black Girl in Search of Herself, The Adventures of the Black Girl in Search from Mr. Shaw, Anticipation, which is in 47, The Torn Veil, which is also in 47, Invisible Scar, which comes out in 66, and Evidence of Passion. And she wrote until the end of her literary career, which ended because she went blind. But that is Mabel Dove Dankwa. So I will kick it back to you, Dev.
So my next person who I'm in awe of sometimes watching her work in Cuba is Maritza Lopez McBean. Maritza is still alive and kicking today, as Darian said. She is one of the people who is making sure that within Cuban society, a revolution within a revolution takes place. And so Maritza is a social worker. She also has her master's, I believe, in political theology, and she runs a community center. She also runs the Paulo Freire Center. She's one of the coordinators of the Paulo Freire Center. She's a coordinator with the Martin Luther King Center in Havana. And she also is one of the co-founders and director of the Red Barrial Afro-Descendiente, which I am grateful enough to call myself a small part of. And really, Maritza is special for me because she was one of the first ones that I listened to and learned from to truly articulate this notion of Black Cubans leading a revolution within the revolution, and articulating it in such a way that is not counter-revolutionary. Is this idea that if Black Cubans are strengthened through the revolutionary process, then the revolutionary process itself is strengthened. And that articulation is so important because, you know, the West and all the imperialist propaganda machines can definitely and have tried to exploit these Black Cubans for a myriad of reasons, but regime change being the top one, of course. And so her work, she uses popular education from a very, very robust Paulo Freirean format or framework. And They have pushed the dialogue on Blackness and race and discrimination around gender and sexuality in Cuba to cutting edge levels. They have leveraged, so basically it's like a network of autonomous projects that are all connected, that help each other and support each other. So they're autonomous while also a part of this network. And they reach everywhere from the grassroots sector to cultural workers and artists and community organizers to journalists and writers, all the way up to the highest levels of the state and government and universities. And actually last year, President Diaz-Canel of Cuba, president, he came and introduced himself to Maritza, saw her community work and went to her community center, praised the work that the Red Barriada Afro-Descendiente has been doing. And so it has actually pushed a narrative in Cuba so strong that 2 years ago, the government said they were going to have a new initiative in combating racial discrimination, and they called on the Red Barrial to be one of the people at the forefront of helping lead that initiative. And so that's the brief overview. I could say a lot more, but Maritza Lopez is super dope. You can Google her name, or you can find her online.
So somewhat related to Maritza is Patricia Rodney, who y'all know I love. So Patricia Rodney wrote this book, The Caribbean State, Healthcare and Women, which is a publication of her dissertation. So there's just simply too much to say about Patricia Rodney, but what's really significant about her, she's also still alive, well, flourishing, thriving in Atlanta. But she really brought together social work, public health, and nursing throughout her life. So she worked as a nurse in Jamaica. She worked in public health in Tanzania. She worked in a local government daycare in Guyana. In Barbados, she worked as a medical social worker at Queen Elizabeth Hospital. She also worked for WAND, which is the Women in National Development, or something like a development organization. She worked in Barbados, but was the program officer for Grenada and Dominica. She worked for the National Black Women's Health Project, which is now called the National Women's Imperative, while she was at Emory, getting her master's degree. And that's where she actually met Angela Davis. She worked for the Canadian Advisory Council on the Status of Women in Ottawa around the time that she was getting her PhD at the University of Toronto. And her focus was on Black women and women's health. And she was a researcher for that body. And then she also worked at the Morehouse School of Medicine, which I'll get to in a minute. But so Patricia Rodney, we talk about healthcare as a human right, universal healthcare. Patricia Rodney really put that into practice and brought a decolonial, anti-imperial, Black women-centered framework to that whole approach. And so I want to focus on the fact that, so she came to Atlanta in 1995 to work at Morehouse's School of Medicine. She was recruited there when she finished her PhD at University of Toronto, and she actually created the public health program at Morehouse School of Medicine. So anybody who is doing public health at Morehouse, Patricia Rodney started that program. It's really important to lift that up. And she developed the International Health Track, and they were the only, Morehouse was then, and it's probably still only the only HBCU that has a course on women's health that's not reduced to maternal or child health. It's on women's health. So treating women, holistically. And then something that she implemented in that program was that her students had to do overseas 3-month practicum, and she helped to get those fellowships and establish and link up those connections. And she's the first person at an HBCU to actually take students to Cuba. And the FBI agents came to visit her because of this. Like she has been tracked. She was being tracked by the FBI for a certain amount of time because of that particular connection she established between Morehouse and Cuba as well. But again, there's so much more to say about her, but we know about Walter Rodney as a historian, as a revolutionary institution builder, but Patricia Rodney is one also. So she's also obviously the head of the Walter Rodney Foundation, which is another institution. But I just can't stress how important she is beyond simply being Walter Rodney's widow. She also was applying in real time the idea, the sort of revolutionary potential of having robust public health systems, and also training nurses, doctors, and social workers in a grassroots way to understand the importance of embedding healthcare systems in communities. And she got this experience from working in Grenada and researching in Grenada and Cuba. And she is a very big proponent of the Cuban healthcare model, not least because those doctors and medical professionals get liberal arts degrees before they get their medical degrees. And so she believes in this holistic training, and also obviously revolutionary, radical, and grassroots approaches to this, right? And so I can ramble on and on, but that's Patricia Rodney. Make sure you check out her book. And you can email her, like hit her up. Don't inundate her with no bullshit, but like, she's around, and, we need to give these revolutionary women their flowers before they pass on. So that is Mama Patricia Rodney.
I would next like to bring up Nanny of the Maroons, or also known as Queen Nanny, who was born towards the end of the 17th century and lived her life until, I don't know, maybe a quarter of the way, a little bit longer into the 18th century. Jamaican guerrilla warfare leader, founder of a town, innovator of a variety of tactics against expanding British colonial projects and the regime of slavery. And I just bring her up because, again, she's someone who's helped me think through space and what it really means to have a town whose existence is in opposition to the entire systems built around it. And I think Nanny of the Maroons was, or is said to be, instrumental in the resistance of self-emancipated Black folks in Jamaica in the first Maroon War, and specifically developing new forms of camouflage, long-range communications, a tactic of completely abandoning a town and letting it be occupied before surprise attacking. I'm a little bit disturbed, maybe not disturbed, maybe saddened at the difficulty in getting a lot of facts about her life and about her political development and her practices. I know she was a spiritual woman, was born in what is now called Ghana. I know her face, or at least a rendition of her face, is on the 500 note. Yeah, there's a variety of ways to encounter her legacy and her political thought, mostly through, I don't know, stories. I think that's how I first heard about her, like verbal stories. But I think it's really important to bring up her work because it, again, was an application of radical thought, of a very specific form of political violence, a necessary form of political violence, and emancipation, and also just the start of a model of something else, in the form of Nanny Town, which could be called Moortown now, but it's a little bit, there's debates about like what it looks like now.
Okay, so the next person that I want to lift up, interestingly, my first three women were contemporaries of one another. So Leila Gonzalez was an Afro-Brazilian academic, activist, born in 1935 and dies in 1994. So interestingly, like me, she was an anthropologist. She actually got her PhD in political anthropology, but she, I believe her father was Afro-Brazilian, her mother was indigenous. Born to in Belo Horizonte, which is infamously known as one of the, a very sort of poor Black Afro-Brazilian community of 18 children. She was second to last of 18 children. And so it's safe to say that she saw some things growing up. But one of the things that's really interesting about Lelia is that she is instrumental in the Black feminist movement in the Brazilian context. She's actually one of the co-founders of the Black Women's Union in the Brazilian context. But as an academic, one of the things as an anthropologist she was really concerned about, she was actually trained as a political anthropologist, but she was very interested in issues of sort of linguistic racism, and also the particular ways that Black women and Black women's bodies were on display, and how that made them or us more susceptible to certain types of violence. And so some of the work that she did was in thinking about the use of morenas, or brown and or Black and Indigenous women in Carnival, and the ways that made us more susceptible to certain types of violence in the Brazilian context. She was, as a part of the Unified Black movement, which was an anti-racist movement in the Brazilian context, she fought against police brutality, the police manipulation of Black people and Black culture. In the Brazilian context, Blackness or Black culture is often taken up as the only way to sort of engage with Blackness, right? Through culture, through Carnival, through these particular ways. And she was adamant about pushing back against that being the only way that Blackness was understood in the Brazilian context. And even through sort of language, one of the interesting things that I think comes up, so she writes about the word Ladino, which is a reference to enslaved or indigenous people with partial education. And then she makes a reference between this term Ladino and bandidos or vandalos, right, which is a thief, or thieves or burglars or vandals or whatever. And then she makes an even sort of bigger connection to the word Latino, right, in this particular, right? So she's making these sort of interesting, I think, connections between the way Blackness and indigeneity is read in the Brazilian context, and then the way Brazilians as Latinos are sort of read in the sort of larger American and or Western imperial kind of context. And again, I said, she's instrumental to the sort of Black feminist movement in Brazil, and she's very much interested in education as a place or a site of struggle, and I guess that makes sense for her as a university professor. And so I think there's some kindredness there with her. So that is my person, Leila Gonzalez.
Love it. Honestly, sounds great. I feel like this whole chat, every single person has been, even the people who I don't know about, I'm like, yeah, I gotta go and do like my Google searches. I need y'all to send me the resources. This person who I'm about to name, everyone should know, is an icon, legend, is truly that girl, been that girl, always gonna be that girl. I'm talking about none other than Miss Assata Shakur. And I know people were probably like, why would you say Assata? Everyone knows Assata. But if I'm being honest, reading that autobiography, 12th grade of high school, the summer between graduating high school and starting college, literally a game changer. And even the things that she was articulating, which was really like a communist politic, I didn't even know, like, have necessarily the language to understand just how deep a lot of the stuff she breaks down in everyday language is. And then as I got older and reread the book, I was like, oh my God, like this is really, it's truly a stunning work. And nowadays we don't get autobiographies, we get memoirs, and we get all these, depoliticized sort of self-biographical poetic waxings. And this was not that at all. It was like a political statement. And so the autobiography, Assata Shakur's autobiography, was the first book that opened my eyes to sort of the world of imperialism, the war on Black people, thinking of things in scientific terms. And then of course, I always encourage people who, and maybe I should say for people who don't know, she was a former Black Panther, Black Liberation Army. She an altercation with the police, was shot in the back and in the chest, and was accused of killing a police officer, even though all evidence points otherwise. She would eventually, with the help of Sundiata Acoli, escape from prison and make her way to Cuba, where she has, received safety and refuge and asylum. And so people need to understand she didn't just stop writing after the autobiography. You can go to assatashakur.org and you can find her writings in several different books and online. Everything she writes is relevant, is sharp. But there's one, I just want to read a quick quote of hers from her piece that she did on hip hop in the 90s. She says, "The US government tried to eliminate me, but I'm not a criminal like they want you to believe or a gangster. The FBI has a way of leaking all kinds of stories about me to the press, the same way they've always tried to criminalize the Black liberation movement. Because of this, we as a people have to be really clear about who we are and what we stand for. I didn't choose to be a COINTELPRO victim. I didn't choose to be a political prisoner or political exile. Those were choices made for me by the US government, the FBI, the CIA, as well as New York City and other local police agencies. There are still 100 or more political prisoners in the US right now, but if enough people would get involved and work for social justice, it would be impossible for the government to continue to isolate activists and imprison us." And so that, those two paragraphs right there summarize so much about her, and she always finds a way to bring it back to the current struggle, always centering political prisoners, political organizers in action, and trying to get people to get involved, get in the streets and get active. And so, Assata Shakur, we love you. Shout out Assata Shakur.
Yeah, Assata. I read Assata as the autobiography. That one, Angela Davis, Afeni Shakur, and Elaine Brown for my undergraduate thesis. And just being breathless, like, oh my gosh, like we gonna do this shit.
The other thing that I really like about that autobiography is the way she pairs time. Like she's thinking about herself in a particular moment as an adult and how it is connected to a particular time for her as a child. And I don't necessarily know that I've seen that many biographies do that either.
And she keeps poetry in every chapter, and she reminds people that poetry is a radical entity that can communicate so much with just saying so little. She has very cutthroat, amazing, beautiful poetry.
So I want to lift up a young activist, organizer, phenom, Yolian Ogbu, who is a member of HOA PALS, which is the Horn of Africa Pan-Africans for Liberation and Solidarity. And so it's important to have intergenerational understandings of struggle and to think not only, oftentimes when we lift people up, it's like our elders. And I think that's really important, but we also have to acknowledge like our lateral peers and also people who we learn from who are younger, right? Because there's not no fucking age limit to liberation struggle. It's people of all ages doing this work. And so Yolian graduated with her degree in political science from the University of North Texas. And she was also the student government president, did a lot of work around climate justice for This Is Zero Hour and other organizations during her time at the University of North Texas. But what's really interesting about Yolian, I had her on the first season of LDI for a class and session segment. And she has a really great understanding of her own political development and how very early on she was sort of funneled into that influencer industrial complex, right? So she was doing all the sort of NGO type leadership development work. And as her political consciousness developed, she was like, oh, hell no, like this ain't it, right? Because she could have very easily been funneled into like Human Rights Watch. And we see the analysis of those types of people from, Eritrea, Ethiopia, the Horn of Africa, and the way that their sort of analysis of the Tigray conflict, for example, the way that they support bombing of Somalia by the US government and AFRICOM. And so she, at her young age, her little age, understood that this is not what I need to be doing with her sort of intellectual and political resources. And so she was also on this really dope webinar that Black Alliance for Peace had called the Challenge of Radical Black Movement Building in 2021 that included Elaine Brown, the homie Dedan Wakuri, and some other folks. And again, she just made it very, very plain in terms of how people like her, people with particular types of skills who are racialized women, right, from from the diaspora, so she's Eritrean, get to sort of become can be made into the face of NGO, right, NGOizing of organizing and struggle. And she again pushed back against that, continues to do work. And so we'll link both of those things, the Challenge of Radical Black Movement Building and then her appearance on the first season of LDI in our show notes. But she continues to do work. She's been, because of her politics, she's been suspended from Twitter a couple times. And so she own it. And so I want to lift her up as a model, not only for her peers and even for people younger than her, but also for us to be thinking about, how do we broaden our critiques? Like what are the things that we need to be understanding and looking at as sort of older organizers, activists, engaged critical thinkers. So what up, Yolian? Keep going, boo.
Next, I want to bring up Octavia Butler. And I want to start by saying I guess a lot of us do, complex feelings about the way Octavia Butler's work and legacy is engaged. I know earlier in this episode, we've talked about struggling against just like identitarian surface level recognitions of people's work. I specifically want to talk about Butler's book, Parable of the Talents, which is so rich, in-depth, instructive, and critical. And it, again, gets a very surface level kind of engagement because it's oddly prophetic in how it describes the impacts of climate change on a variety of communities around the world. And in the United States specifically, there's, some Republican presidential candidate character in the book whose slogan is "Make America Great Again." And that's like a big thing that comes up a lot. And even though the book was published in 1998, but for me as an urban planner, I regularly gasp whenever I return to this book because she almost applies what I mentioned about the guerrilla tactics of Nanny of the Maroons. So she talks about like what it means to start a community that's in opposition to a fascist colonial project. Specifically in the context of California, where she's from, she describes in great detail what it means to build a town, what it means to be connected to the economies of other towns, what it means to incorporate children into the political process in a very generative way, literally how their lessons are structured. What does it look like to organize space for a democratic process that is not liberal democracy or representative democracy? What does it look like to be thinking through the application of socialist ideas in a real-time kind of way, in a very messy way, to have a community that grows with people who join, who have inherited a lot of really violent frameworks of race, of gender, of ownership. And yeah, I think sometimes her work just kind of gets flattened into a very like, oh, look at, this is Afrofuturist because there's a little bit of like futurist kind of technology and some Black folks existing, I guess. And I think her writing, specifically in Parable of the Talents, is incredible and instructive. Literal descriptions of schedules for keeping watch, for the role of guns, for how you deal with and navigate and negotiate getting property for individuals or collectives. So I just want to point everyone in the direction of that book specifically if you're interested in really beautiful science fiction writing that is essentially a guide to a revolutionary project. is really intense. All of her books are really, really intense. But I think Octavia Butler's life and how she applied her perspective, specifically being, I think, originally inspired by Black nationalist movements that she encountered when she was in community college, is really important.
Listen, we all need more Earthseed books of the living in our life, okay? So my next person is someone that people know also, Winnie Mandela. But instead of describing her, I just want to read a little bit from her. So there's a book, 491 Days, which is a compilation of her journal and prison letters from the time she spent in prison. And so I'm just going to read a little bit from that. On a freezing cold winter's morning, some hours before dawn on May 12th, on Monday, the 12th of May, 1969, security police arrived at the Soweto home of Winnie Mandela and detained her in the presence of her 2 young daughters. At the time, she was banned and restricted to the Orlando township and unable to leave or even visit her husband, Nelson Mandela, who was in the 5th year of his life sentence. Mrs. Mandela and at least 40 others were rounded up and detained under Section 6 of the Terrorism Act, which was passed in 1967 and designed for the security police to hold people and interrogate them for as long as they chose. She was driven to Pretoria Central Prison and held incommunicado, not knowing what would happen with her children, who were ages 10 and 9 at the time. She was not allowed to bring her medication for an existing heart condition. Her first interrogation started on May 26th and lasted for 5 days and nights. On the second day, she began having dizzy spells and palpitations, and a day later, her blackouts began. One of her sisters brought her a case against the minister to stop her and her fellow accused from being assaulted. Mrs. Mandela and 21 others appeared 5 months later in the old synagogue in Pretoria, the same makeshift court where her husband was sentenced to 5 years in prison on November 7th, 1962. The trial, known as the Trial of the 22, or the State versus Samson Ndu, and 21 others, started on December 1st, 1969. All pled not guilty to charges under the Suppression of Communism Act. These charges included establishing a group of committees within the banned ANC, taking or administering the oath of the ANC, recruiting members to the ANC, arranging and attending meetings for the ANC, inspecting trains to find sabotage targets, devising means of obtaining explosives, discussing and distributing publications by the ANC, and more. After a range of witnesses failed to testify, and after Shati Naidu and Ndonwe Mankala were sentenced to 2 months for refusing to testify against her, the court adjourned to February 1970. All 22 were acquitted, but immediately redetained. 6 months later, they faced the same charges under the Terrorism Act. On September 14, 1970, Mrs. Mandela and all the accused, except for Mr. Ramotswe, were acquitted. As soon as she was able to, Mrs. Mandela kept a journal, which she shared with her advocate and did not see again until 2011, which was brought to the police. It said, on the 10th of May, I had been referred to my doctor, the specialist, Dr. Berman, who gave me a prescription, which I took to the chemist in West Street. I did not get all the tablets at the chemist. I was told to get the rest on Monday the 10th, which was a Saturday, and I had enough tablets for the weekend. When Mr. Victor of the Johannesburg Security Branch told me I would have to accompany him as he was detaining me under the Terrorism Act, I wrote down the name of the chemist and the prescription number and requested Peter Mugubane, who knew the chemist, to fetch the rest of the tablets with the message that they should be given to my attorney. And that is how she ended up spending those 491 days in prison. I think the last thing I'll say about Winnie, since so many of us know her, what's important I think about Winnie is that during Mandela's time in prison, she ends up becoming more and more radicalized over time, right? And it is partially through her semi-freedom outside of prison at the time, and attempting to raise her children and attempting to maintain the fight that Mandela began before he went into prison, that she becomes victimized and that she becomes radicalized, right? And so I think in spite of the fact that they end up not continuing to be married, Winnie becomes a very important figure in the South African context, and I think to Black radical women everywhere, not least of which because of, I think, the way she understood her responsibility, not just to Nelson, but as Nelson Mandela's wife, to the people of South Africa in the struggle for liberation against apartheid, but also in general in the struggle for Black liberation. And so I would just recommend that people look up Winnie as her own character and not only as the wife of Nelson Mandela, because she has a very interesting and radical transformation over the course of her time as Nelson Mandela's wife and later as Winnie Mandela herself.
It's interesting because Patricia Rodney, you know, is writing her memoir, and one of the two memoirs that she sort of it was thinking with is Rita Marley and then Winnie Mandela.
I love Winnie Mandela a lot. I wrote a piece about her for the Workers' World newspaper when she passed, actually. And people also need to remember she was an internationalist and she gave solidarity to Palestine and to sort of liberation struggles all around, even when her contemporaries refused or had been bought off or sold out in several ways. So I just want to throw that out there too. She maintained a fire when others did not. And speaking of fire, my good sis, my bestie, my comrade in arms and struggle, Miss Erica Keynes is my next person, AKA Ricky Ryan. Sharice, I know me and you be right here with Erica. That's y'all's BAP sister, I know. Erica I became friends with Erica, ironically enough, through social media, but it was because every time, this was many years ago too, back when, you know, everything felt so important on social media. And the arguments that people would have, me and Erica were always consistently, every time, the only ones unafraid to be unpopular and to give a very scientific, very objective response and look at the material reality of the situation. And Erica became so unpopular that she was eventually banned from Twitter and suspended. But that is really how I came to know Erica. And since then, we have organized together. We've done political education work together. We have written and thought together and discussed and struggled and continued to build. And for those of you who don't know, Erica is a community organizer based out of Baltimore with BAP, the Black Alliance for Peace, as well as Regina's People Party. She is the founder, of Liberation Through Reading, an initiative which gives children free books, and at the same time is also a monthly study group and reading group where they read revolutionary texts and discuss them together and study them together. She's a writer with Hood Communists, and she recently published a piece, I think in December, called Imperialism, Unpacking the Primary Contradiction. And anyone who knows Erica knows that one thing about Erica, she's going to talk about imperialism. She's going to talk about the contradictions, and she's going to make sure you know exactly how she feels. And it's because she takes political education more seriously than anyone I've ever met. She takes it personal, she takes it seriously, she's good at it. And so I learned so much from Erica every day. Even her writing about being a mother and how being a mother in revolutionary spaces informs her politics and informs what she's doing. Me and Darian just had a conversation with her for the Groundings podcast, shout out, shameless plug, about this exact topic. And she's just always, I don't know, she's such a critical thinker. So Erica, I love you. Not only am I astounded at all the work you do, but I know in the future you're going to continue to do even more work. And I'm talking to you directly because I know you're going to watch this. So, yeah.
You know, Erica gonna be what thing? She gonna be in that chat.
Yes, in all of them, and she ain't half stepping in none of them either.
No, she's dragging from the chat. She getting Z chicken nuggets, dragging, tapping into another webinar because that's just Erica. So yes,
Erica will be in the chat every day while also in the group chat with me, texting, talking about the chat. So I love you, Erica. Yeah.
We do, yes, Erica. Definitely. And it's so interesting because it's full circle with me and Erica, because I remember her saying when she first heard me a long ass time ago on Left Pocket, it was like, whatever was not with my critique of feminism, right? But that is, you know, propelled her to learn to go read other things, right? And it's like now I learned so much from her. Like she's the main person. Anytime I have a problem, we about to have a meeting this week because I got some issues. And so Erica, she's always talking people off the ledge. She's always bringing people into organizing and political education. So it's like there's, you know, she's one of one in that regard. And shout out to my favorite revolutionary, Zion. But okay, so I want to talk about Gwendolyn Patton. This is her autobiography, My Race to Freedom: A Life in the Civil Rights Movement. So Gwen Patton, I think, to me, is up there with people like Kwame Ture and MLK when it comes to civil rights and Black power, period. But we don't know very much about her. But she was not only a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, she was an anti-Vietnam War activist and also was a Black power right. And so she started as a member of the Montgomery Improvement Association, which was the organization that organized the Montgomery bus boycott. She moved into the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, which was the sort of impetus for the Black Panther Party. She then went on to become the chair of SNCC's Black Women's Liberation Committee, which was formed in 1969, that went on to transform into the Third World Women's Alliance. But sort of what I'm thinking about today is she organized and was a co-founder of the National Black Anti-War, Anti-Draft Union in 1968. And so obviously she's anti-imperialist, anti-war, from a sort of Black and Pan-African centered perspective. And that is what we are. That's where we need to be. And so that's why I'm partially wanting to lift her up. But so Ashley Farmer wrote the following about Gwen and the National Black, it's a long title, but the NBA WADU. So she said that she helped to found it in 1968. In her writings and speeches, she explained her intellectual rationale for a Black power anti-war group. They were twofold. First, she argued that Black power activists needed an organization that mobilized at the intersection of racism and imperialism, or one that pinpointed how the atrocities of imperialism and that of Vietnam were only a stepping stone to world exploitation by the American imperialists. Second, she maintained that the white-led peace movement was content to end the war, but leave racism and imperialism intact. It was divisive and did nothing to change the lot of Black men who are being drafted because of the racist genocidal Vietnam War. Although short-lived, this NAB WADU activists organized anti-war marches in Washington, D.C., and members also hosted an anti-war conference in 1968 that over 700 activists attended. So this is just completely instructive for this whole Ukraine shit, right? It's not enough to be anti-war, you have to be anti-imperialist. And it's not enough to be anti-imperialist, you also have to understand the connections between war and imperialism. Word to Lenin. And so it's just Du Bois too, but it's very, and she just had this clarity in the 1960s, right? Like, how is it that we're forgetting? Like, anyway, let me not rant. But the other thing that I want to lift up about her is her gender analysis. She has this piece in Tony K. Bambra's The Black Woman called Black People in the Victorian Ethos. And this piece is really, really important because it's not intersectionality, okay? Like there are just so many other forms of gender analysis that are not intersectionality. I'm not saying people can do whatever the fuck they want, but like, it's not the apotheosis. And again, she's writing this in the 1970s. And so I just want to read this a little bit from here because she is critiquing the Moynihan report. And the Moynihan report was basically like the Black family's fucked up because Black women are the head of household. That's the tagline, right? So she says, contrary to Moynihan's report, the Victorian philosophy, and this is the Victorian ethos is like basically the patriarchal family structure, right? She says this has always existed in the Black family, and because the philosophy prevails, it has caused many problems and contradictions. The women can work as nannies, cooks, or maids, and their pride and or femininity will not be in jeopardy. However, Black men cannot be janitors or porters for fear of losing pride and a large dose of masculinity. Consequently, the women economically controlled the family, and inadvertently, according to the Victorian philosophy, Black males were not men because they were not breadwinners. Some men ran to the church to be deacons and preachers to regain masculinity. Others ran to the street to be con men, dope pushers, or pimps to gain pride and prestige with the almighty dollar, which is the strictest equalizer of the capitalist system. But the masses of Black men became lumpen proletariat who were candidates for dope or alcohol. Meanwhile, Black women became cold, dull, ugly Amazons who were desired in an animalistic way because of their firm voluptuousness and not because of their femininity, because they indeed lacked fragility and helplessness in a cold war as breadwinners, in a cold world as breadwinners. According to the Victorian philosophy, Black women became the rapers of Black manhood. And then Black men, on the other hand, were boys who did not know what to do with their penises, but only to use them to keep their women in line. Again, the Victorian philosophy of the big stick. So that's just a little fraction of that piece, which is such a good analysis rooted in the contradictions in the Black family. So again, it's understanding the effects of capitalism, patriarchy, and even imperialism on creating havoc, and it's not just interpersonal relationships between Black men and Black women. It's a broader structural problem. So again, when you understand the primary contradiction as imperialism or as capitalism, the type of analysis you have even about gender and sexuality is better. So that's Gwendolyn Patton, y'all. There's so much more to say about her, but definitely look her up, read her autobiography, and read Ashley Farmer's 2 pieces in in Black Perspectives, which is the African American Intellectual History Society blog, which we'll link. So yeah.
I loved every single word that you just shared. This next person is, I think, the only like conventional academic on my list. I'm gonna keep it short and brief, but her work is really, really important to me, and hopefully to us. Andrea R. Roberts, who is the founder of the Texas Freedom Colonies Project. She's a current urban planning professor at Texas A&M University. She, I think, I don't even know if she positions her work in this way, but I think her work exploring the over 500 independent, at times separatist Black communities that were founded across Texas post-emancipation is helpful to understand like what's been tried, what tactics have failed, what tactics have succeeded, and some of the predicaments that we find ourselves in today. So Andrea Roberts' work explores how ideas of racial uplift, at times respectability politics, different forms of Black capitalism were tried, what that looked like, why a lot of those places don't exist anymore, what happened to them. And also I think specifically this issue that's kind of slept on in my field, and I think even in local political struggles that we see now, is like the issue of unincorporation. So the fact that Black communities who desired some form of self-determination or self-government, having to form community and organizations outside of the bounds of, you know, a town or a city or any kind of government jurisdiction, for survival, like to exist as a group of people, and how that was helpful, and also where that leads us now, where the capitalist state has found a way to make those places visible, and exploit that land and exploit those people, not provide folk service, you know, similar to North Carolina, sort of plantocracies, local plantocracies, using that previous invisibility to dump waste, to poison people, to underpay people. And I think Andrea Roberts has gathered a lot of knowledge and a lot of people together to resist a lot of these forces. It's mostly like old Black folks, you know, out in the middle of Texas, who have stories to tell, who have tactics to share, thinking through how to pass on knowledge to younger people. So there's also a lot of young researchers and young organizers associated with the Texas Freedom Colonies Project that are doing work across Black cemeteries that are threatened by climate change, doing work documenting the different ways that some of this knowledge is passed on, be it cookouts, be it reenactment, quilting, storytelling. And I think some of her articles and some of her talks, which maybe we can link to in the show notes, are cautionary tales, because there are a number of projects that seemed to have, provided, at least on a micro level, some form of like additional freedom to Black people who thought maybe they could have a stake in the United States government or the colonial project of the United States. And she kind of explores where they ended up and what leads to movements being co-opted or subverted. So I think her work's really, really important. And I think if we take the task of self-critique seriously, then we have to engage projects that have failed or projects that have ended up in weird, nebulous, and dubious places.
So my last one is someone, again, who everyone knows, and I'm probably going to catch some slack for even mentioning this person right now. But I would be lying if I said that Angela Davis was not completely critical and foundational. Come on, I see the free Angela Davis shirt. If she was not foundational to my understanding of prisons, abolition, political prisoners as well. And I think like millions, probably not millions, that's an exaggeration, but probably thousands of people feel the same way and feel that, she was a very key stepping stone into radicalism and more revolutionary politics. Even though now I do have massive critiques of her and sort of her maneuvering into a celebrity activist role, supporting Democratic candidates and all that kind of stuff, but her work itself around prisons, not just are prisons obsolete, I think that's like the first thing people think of, which is a very great work, but I'm specifically thinking about this essay that she wrote in 1971 from Marion County Jail. And it's talking about political prisons, prisoners, Black liberation. And it's one of the first articulations that I have seen very concisely, succinctly, and deeply woven together that talks about, and this is something that I have said in my own work and sort of molded to kind of update it, but that under a colonial capitalist system, prisons create political prisoners out of colonized and exploited people. Essentially saying that why sort of this division of political prisoners and criminals is itself a problematic division that we need to antagonize. And that, I always say, if you catch me on the right day, I'll say all Black and Indigenous people inside of US prisons are political prisoners to a certain extent. Of course, there's a difference between people who are incarcerated due to political work. However, as she talks about in this essay, she gets into the notion that the fascistic tendency of the US and the heightened contradictions of racism and anti-Black discrimination and exploitation have forced the political use of prisons by the fascistic government into the forefront. She's saying that like the conditions and contradictions have heightened so much that the political use of prisons is now there and open for everyone to see. And so I just encourage everyone to go read the essay. It's very long. I'm not going to talk about the whole thing, but I remember reading this essay at a very early stage in my political development, and it connected so many dots for me for how I was feeling about incarceration and prison and political prisoners and the work that I wanted to do around those issues. And I think of Women, Race, and Class, that is a very foundational book for how I thought about gender politics very early on, and sort of a material recognition of all that kind of stuff. And so Angela Davis, and we had the pleasure of speaking with Angela Davis at the Walter Rodney Symposium 2 years ago. Sharice and Erica were on a panel with her. It was a very fun, interesting time. I won't say much more on that, but shout out Angela Davis. I don't fuck with her now, I'll be honest with you, but her work itself from way back when, I heavily cannot pretend like it wasn't influential for me.
We all have problematic faves.
Yeah, but she's like reaching me.
Yeah, lately for sure.
Yeah.
The master class is like the final straw for sure.
Whew, don't get Cherie started on the master class.
Okay. All right.
Okay, so my last revolutionary woman is a woman named Molina Koyate. So Molina Koyate was I shouldn't even just say a. So I wanted to figure out, so you all know I'm a member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, GC. I wanted to figure out a way to bring in the AAPRP in a general sense into this conversation. So Molina was born in '64 in Boston, and some of her early organizing work was with the National Tenants' Rights Organization. And she spent that time representing poor and oppressed, but particularly African women, and rose to the ranks to become the regional coordinator for the Northeast. But as a, after she never left that work entirely, but as her work progressed, she joined the All African People's Revolutionary Party in 1973. And she was very instrumental in bringing busloads of students, women, and workers to African Liberation Day in Washington, D.C. every year from the moment that she joined. She importantly was, obviously all of this stuff is important, but she was one of the co-founders of the All African Women's Revolutionary Union. And she was actually the first woman elected to the Central Committee of the All African People's Revolutionary Party by the party masses. So it's important to note that the original formed Central Committee had 5 women on it, but when I say elected, the original Central Committee was made up of people who came together who had a shared vision, right? So they weren't necessarily elected to that position. And there was one woman elected to the CC before her. Her name was Maisha Rakib, but Maisha Rakib was elected to the CC by the women's constituency, so by the women's union. But Molina was the first person elected by the party masses to the Central Committee of the All People's Revolutionary Party. She was very critical in helping to advance the party's anti-Zionist and pro-African United Front political line. And I wanted to end with some of her own words. So one of the things that the party did was often submit these statements of self-criticism. So in February, and self-criticism isn't just in the negative sense, right? But it's an observation of the work that one has been doing, to multiple ends. So in February of 1983, in what appeared to be a clear but mistaken subversion of democratic centralism, the AAWRU leadership voted at its meeting that only the women voted to leadership by the women could make policy decisions concerning the union, to the exclusion of women in the leadership voted by the entire party. My position opposing the decision on the basis of that memo led the CC to modify its policy. Since the CC's modification, I have led the implementation of that policy, a clear example of my understanding of a primary element of democratic centralism, which is the primacy of the leading body over the subordinate body. In this case, over the regional AAWRU leadership. The whole is always greater than any part. And I think this is just an important sort of solidification of who she was in the organization and what she brought to the organization and the way that they interacted with one another. So that is my last Black revolutionary woman, Molina Koyate, but she passed away in 2002 in Gambia, but she was born in Boston.
Born in Boston, okay. So the last woman that I want to talk about is Louise Thompson Patterson, and a pretty good biography written about her is called Louise Thompson Patterson, A Life of Struggle for Justice by Keith Gilliard. I actually reviewed this book, which is why I say it's pretty good. But anyway, LTP is amazing. She is one half of a power couple. She was married to William Patterson, who was one of the main editor and one of the main architects of We Charge Genocide. He is a revolutionary, but she is her own singular revolutionary. She, even before marrying him, she was doing her thing. So some highlights. I have an affinity for her because she graduated from UC Berkeley. Go Bears. She was a Delta though, but that's okay. But she taught at Hampton Institute. She joined anyway, people can't make the right decision all the time. But she taught at Hampton Institute and joined the Communist Party in 1937. She actually organized a group of writers from Harlem, a group of writers, intellectuals, and activists, and sort of culture workers from Harlem to go visit the Soviet Union. And she became known as sort of Mother Moscow at a certain moment. She also was an organizer to free the Scottsboro boys. Actually, the Daisy Bates, who was one of the women who initially accused the Scottsboro Nine of rape, began to testify on behalf of the boys to get them exonerated. And Louise Thompson Patterson, she would often stay at Louise Thompson Patterson's house. Louise Thompson Patterson helped her with her own sort of political development, her among other people like Tyra Edwards. So she was just amazing. She was one of the founding members of the Sojourners for Truth and Justice, and a member of the National Women's Action Committee. One of the things I wanted to lift up that she wrote is called Toward a Brighter Dawn, which she wrote in 1936. So for people who know about Claudia Jones' 1949 and Into the Neglect of the Problem of the Negro Woman, 1936 is an earlier articulation of that, or Toward a Brighter Dawn, which was written in 1936, is an earlier articulation of that talks about Black women being oppressed as Negroes, as women, and as workers. And that particular piece came out of the National Negro Congress's Women's Commission. And so she's a really important theoretician and organizer and activist, and leader in the CPUSA. She lived almost 100 years. So she died, I want to say, in 1999. 98 or 99. And so there's much more to say about her, but she's amazing. Read about her, read her work. And, again, triple oppression is not intersectionality. There's another framework, a way to think about the role of Black women. So she, again, was a very early sort of theorizer of that. LTP.
And on that note, I did want to explicitly bring up Claudia Jones because I know she's come up a few times in this conversation. And I can just mention like a few details about her, but really we can maybe all chime in and reflect. But born in Trinidad in 1915, lived a really short life, which is maybe a pattern with a lot of the people that we've mentioned, and that shouldn't go unnoticed, but active in CPUSA as well, like CBS just mentioned, wrote a lot of really powerful things, but I think specifically I want to point people who aren't familiar to the direction of an end to the neglected problems of the Negro woman, which was published in 1949. As CBS said, might get flattened into the lineage or like forcibly placed in the lineage of intersectionality, but as part of a different political project. She describes super exploitation, both describes the material conditions that Black women were dealing with, but also applying a really generative critique to all communist parties to work through and to articulate and to incorporate Black women's role in resisting imperialism, in resisting capitalism. And she spent a lot of time writing about domestic workers specifically, was deported by the United States because of the Subversive Activities Control Act of 1950, but then became very active in the Communist Party of Great Britain as well. Was a founder of the Notting Hill Carnival celebration. And I think one detail that I really want to focus on, maybe because I was complaining to Dev about this, I don't know, a week or two ago, is how instrumental her work is in a radical Black press and creating the platform for the masses of Black people to raise their political consciousness, but also develop ideas as a collective and have ongoing discussions and debates and discourses in a very publicly accessible way, by being one of the founders of the West Indian Gazette and also working with folks like Amy Ashwood Garvey, who's Jamaican Pan-Africanist, director of Black Star, her spouse is, Marcus Garvey. But yeah, I think specifically her work on the West Indian Gazette is really influential to me in the work that I do. I think lately I've been mourning the loss of some of these huge platforms, like the Gazette, like Muhammad Speaks newspaper, like the Pittsburgh Courier, where if you turn the pages, you see how Black folk, pre-internet, were engaged in internationalist thinking, were engaged in solidarity struggles with non-Black people, were engaged in developing an anti-imperialist politic as events like the World War II were unfolding, the Vietnam War were unfolding. So if you want to learn more about Claudia Jones, I have to point folks in the direction of her own writing, but also maybe Carol Boyce Davies' book, Left of Karl Marx. And yeah, I'm really grateful for her work.
Yeah, shameless plug. We also did a special issue called Claudia Jones, Foremother of World Revolution in the Journal of Intersectionality that dropped, I think, last summer. There's writing by myself, Jifeng Liu, Robin Spencer, Denise Lin, Jesse Benjamin. And then I also did an interview with Carol Boyce Davies about actually the archiving process, because she's the one that brought Claudia Jones's papers to the Schomburg. So check that out if you want to learn more about Claudia Jones. All right, y'all. So I want to thank so much Dev and Darian for being here to have this wide-ranging, super informative. Hopefully also, you all learned a lot from the conversations, the information that was shared, and again, to sort of engage radical, revolutionary Black African women, not from an identitarian perspective, but because they're actually struggling to build the world anew, right? They're actually making contributions. And in some ways, their identity is tangential. In some ways it is absolutely central because of the standpoint, the framework, and the experience that it provides in guiding their sort of ideological development in the types of practices in which they engage. So thank you.
That's a wrap.
All right, y'all, I have a quick and dirty rant for our last episode of the season, and that's watch our shit. Watch these latest episodes. I don't know what's going on with the views, but like these last few episodes have been bangers. There's been great conversation. They've been engaging, and I know a lot is going on. It's getting warm outside. Y'all going for jogs and having picnics or whatever. I don't know, but please go back and watch our most recent episodes, and also please watch the very special episode with Keto Swan. It is an amazing episode. As I mentioned earlier, it's a great episode. It is really good. And for whatever reason, it didn't get that many views, maybe because we're on break, but go watch our shit. As we were talking about in our Shoot the Shit, we put a lot of work and a lot of effort into this, and we know you all get a lot out of it when you watch. So go fucking watch. Appreciate y'all.
And that's a wrap for this season. Thanks for tuning in. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you chose to be here with us. So thanks again, as always. I'm Dr. Layla Brown here with my girl, Dr. CBS. Thanks as always to Two Black in the Back. And we're signing off.
Peace if you're willing to fight for it. Ow. Just playing. Sorry. Cut that out. I don't know.